Good evening. Wherever you may be, welcome to the IGRA webinar for this evening. My name is Gary Regev. I'm the past president of IGRA, and I'm going to introduce our speaker for the evening in one moment. I wanted to show you first the website of IGRA and to point out to you the other important events that we have coming up. They're all listed on the side of the web page. We have our Zoom show and tell series tomorrow and on Wednesday. One is talking about research in Lithuania, the other in Hebrew, research in Vienna, and it continues on. Everything is listed here for you. You need to register in advance. And please note the seminar day on June 23rd. Join us. It is free. It's going to be online. And the program is inside. When you click on the title of the seminar day, you can see the program for the day. You can come and join for as many lectures or as few lectures as you want during the day, coming in and out. So I will go ahead now and introduce Thierry. The webinar will present essential sources for the genealogy of ancestors in Tunisia. In the last 10 years, there have been major progress in the publication of genealogical sources, allowing to reach the early 19th or late 18th centuries in many cases. Thierry has been researching his family in France, Tunisia, and Romania since 2010. He is the founder of the Tunisian research team at one of the genealogy societies in Paris and has authored numerous articles, co-authored a book, and published 2 foundational databases for the genealogy of Tunisian Jews. And we are very, very happy to have him with us this evening. And I will now turn over the webinar to Thierry.
Thank you, Gary. Good evening, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. I'm located in Paris right now. So let me try and share my screen here. And hopefully you should see the title page for this webinar. So I'm going to spend 40 minutes discussing major sources for the genealogy of Tunisian Jews. And so let me skip to the next slide here. So giving you a very brief history of Tunisia and Jews in Tunisia, looking at Tunisian sources, looking at French sources, and as you may know, in 1956, Tunisia became independent, and roughly half of Jews in Tunisia migrated to Israel, and the other half migrated to France. So I'm going to talk about Tunisian sources, French sources. I'm not going to talk about Israeli sources, because IGRA is there exactly for that purpose. And you'll find a lot of information about Tunisian Jews in Israeli sources. But I'm going to focus on Tunisian sources, French sources, some additional sources in other places. You'll see it's a bit surprising, but you can find a lot of information about Tunisian Jews in the UK, in Malta, in the Netherlands, of all places, and even some other places. And then this is going to cover roughly the 19th and 20th centuries. We're going to have a glimpse at really old sources for Jews in Tunisia. And then we're going to look ahead what other sources would be published in coming years, and what other sources remain to be exploited. So without further ado, a brief history of Tunisia, Tunisian Jews. As you may know, there are some legends about Jews arriving in Djerba, in the south of Tunisia, from Jerusalem in the First Temple periods. This is essentially a legend. There is no documentation or historical records whatsoever. Then we have Carthago, which was destroyed by the Romans in 146 before Common Era. And it's quite likely that along with the Phoenicians who founded Carthago, some Jews went along. And there are some suggestions that there was a significant Jewish community in Carthago in antiquity. And then there is another legend, which is that some Kohanim flew after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era and settled in Djerba, possibly even with a door of the temple. Again, this is a legend, and we don't have evidence for that. The first historical evidence of Jewish presence in Tunisia dates from the 2nd century. There is a beautiful synagogue with some beautiful pavings in Naho, which was by then Tunisia as a Roman province called Ifriqiya in the 3rd and 4th century. And then in 600, in the second half of the 7th century, there was the Arab conquest of North Africa and the foundation of Kairouan, by Oqba ibn Nafi, and Kairouan became a holy city of Islam. At the same time, Kairouan also became a very important center of Jewish learning. There was a very strong and vibrant Jewish community in Kairouan, with renowned doctors of medicine and renowned rabbis, especially in the 10th and 11th century. Kairouan served as a relay post, if you will, between the academies, the Jewish academies in Iraq and in Palestine, and centers of learning, of Jewish learning in Iberia. And in 1057, there was the sack of Kairouan by Arab tribes in retaliation for the current rulers of Tunisia abandoning the Fatimids. The Fatimids sent the Hilalian tribes to destroy Tunisia, and those tribes destroyed Kairouan. And that was the end of this first community, Jewish community of Kairouan. And it was also the start of a very chaotic period in the history of Tunisia. In the mid-12th century, Normans invaded and ruled Tunisian coastal cities. Then the Almohads came, which was a Muslim dynasty, and they were very difficult with the Jews who were forced to convert or to die. So a lot of them flew to other parts of the Mediterranean, and those who stayed probably couldn't practice Judaism openly. Fortunately, that period came to an end with the Hafsids in 1236. That was the start of the Hafsid dynasty in Tunisia, and the Hafsids were a lot more open, especially with Jews. So a lot of Jews reverted back to Judaism and came back to Tunisia. And also the Hafsid dynasty traded a lot with many places in the Mediterranean, especially Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, Valencia especially was a big center of trading with Hafsid Tunisia. And there were a lot of exchanges of migrations. Jews moving to and from Tunisia, to and from the European shores of the Med. In 1534, Charles V from Spain conquers Tunis and props up the dying Hafsid dynasty. There was the sack of Tunis, and then Spain kept a fort just outside Tunis for 50 years until the Ottoman conquest of Tunis in 1574. And the Ottomans installed a pasha, and then the militia, the Turkish militia, the Dey was the head of the Turkish militia, and the Turkish militia conquered power, removed the pasha, and basically became the ruler of Tunisia. And then the Beys, which were another Ottoman or Turkish type of officer, the Beys became the rulers of Tunisia. And in 1705, Hussein Ben Ali became the new Bey of Tunis, and he founded the Husseinite dynasty, which was going to rule Tunisia until independence in the 20th century. 5 years later, somewhat independently from the Hussein dynasty, there was a separation between two Jewish communities in Tunisia, and you will see later that that has an impact on the records that you find, because some records are for one community and other records are for the other community. And this is a unique case, I believe, in the world, or at least in North Africa, where there were actually two separate Jewish communities. The indigenous Jewish community called the Twansa community, and the Jews coming from Livorno, the Livornese community, which was called the Grana community. And so they agreed to separate in 1710, and each had its own head rabbi, its own records, its own rules, and they lived separately until essentially the Second World War. In 1857, the Pacte Fondamental was granted by the Bey, and this was a very important document that said that all of the Bey's subjects, both Muslims and Jews and Christians, were treated on an equal footing. Now, this was fairly theoretical, unfortunately. It was not applied immediately, but it was a very important document, and it changed the way the Jewish community interacted with the rest of Tunisian society. In 1864, there was a big insurrection in Tunisia, and Arab tribes from the interior invaded coastal cities and attacked Europeans and Jews, and large numbers of Jews from the coastal cities of Tunisia flew to Malta for 6 months. That's actually quite interesting for genealogy, because Malta had very good records, especially BMD records at the time, and so you find a lot of BMD records in Malta dealing with Tunisian Jews who happened to be born in Malta, like my own great-grandfather, or married in Malta, or died in Malta in the second half of 1864. Some of them stayed in Malta, and so you do find some records in Malta for Tunisian Jews. And probably the most important date in all of this is 1881. That is the start of a French protectorate in Tunisia. The Bey remained nominally in power, but actually political power was vested with a French officer in Tunisia, and the Bey just signed laws. This is a very important date because it's the start of modern Tunisia with a modern system of BMD records, and we're going to look at that in detail. BMD records were instituted in Tunisia in 1886 by the French protectorate. It's also the start of the French period in Tunisia, where Tunisian Jews started becoming a bit more French, and in some cases were naturalized before moving to France after independence. A lot of them got French nationality, requested French nationality, especially from the 1920s. And finally, in 1956, Tunisia declared independence from France, and most Jews left Tunisia for France and for Israel. So moving on, what sources can we find in Tunisia proper? Native Tunisian sources are quite difficult both to access and to exploit. So first of all, we have BMD records. As I said, they start in 1886, and there are no BMD records in Tunisia before French protectorate, or more accurately, sorry, no Tunisian BMD records before French protectorate. Obviously, they are kept in Tunisia, but it's extremely difficult to access. You have to prove filiation to obtain records in Tunisia. However, it is easier to use copies that are kept at the French diplomatic archives near Paris, and they're accessible there for the period between 1886 to 1913 for death records, 1917 for birth records. So you can go to Paris and browse those on microfilms. Or we have the full database with images of the records accessible online for members of Cercle de Genealogie Juive, which is the Jewish genealogical society in Paris. And this is probably the most important tool for the genealogy of Tunisian Jews. We look at that in more detail a bit later. So this one is reasonably easy to access. After 1920, the French copies, the copies of BMD records are kept by the French administration, mostly for French citizens, although they do have some copies as well for some Jews who remain Tunisian citizens. And you can request records online at the link that is shown there. They don't always find what you need, and of course you also need to request the record. You also need to know the date, which is not always the case. So it's a bit more difficult for the previous periods between 1886 and 1913. There is an index, and so you can request records by name, by first name, and by date as well. So that's civil BMD records. For religious records and other records, first of all, you have some ketubot, marriage contracts from 1898 to the present. Those can be delivered as a certificate, and you have to email the secretary of the head rabbi of Tunisia. You have email there, and in the handout you will have all of this information. There is a 20 euros processing fee. You have to know the date as well, and this will give you the father's names of the groom and the brides. Not the mother's name, unfortunately, but it's quite useful. And then you have some very interesting records stored at the Tunisian National Archives. You can, of course, travel to Tunisia and browse those records, but using them is very difficult because they are handwritten in Sephardic cursive scripts called ma'alak, which is quite hard to read, and typically they are also written in Judeo-Arabic, which few people speak nowadays. There are some records that are usable that we're going to look at. One set are the ketubot registers of a Portuguese community. This is the Grana community I mentioned, the second community, Jewish community in Tunisia. and there are registers of rabbinical notaries, which hold very interesting documents, but very hard to use. There are also civil court records and property records in Tunisia, kept by the, or initiated by the French. Those are held in Tunisia in provincial courts. They're very difficult to access. In practice, I've never been able to access those. So we'll forget about them. Let's focus for a second on Ketubot registers of the Portuguese community in Tunis. Portuguese community is the Jews coming from Leghorn, Livorno, established as a separate Jewish community. So there used to be 10 registers covering the period 1754 to 1917. So six registers have been found. So first of all, you have two books offered by Robert Attal and Mr. Avivi, which were published in 1989 and 2000 by the Ben-Zvi Institute in Jerusalem, which have indexes for registers 2, 4, and 5. This is a total of 1,264 ketubots covering 70 years. You have the books, which you can find easily in Israel, although one of them might be out of print. But there is a very useful online index available, done by Bob Cassuto, and you have the URL here, and you will have that URL on the handout as well. And there is also another book offered by my colleagues at Service Genealogy Juive, Alain Nedja and Gilles Boulu, published in 2015, which indexed registers 3 and 6 for a total of 675 ketubots and 43 years. So these provide continuous coverage for marriages of the Livornese Jews in Tunis between 1788 and 1881, almost 2,000 ketubots, 100 years, and we still have 4 registers missing that have yet to be located, which are registers 1 and 7 to 10. So on the right side of the slide, you can see an example of a ketubah in register 3 or 6. Those 2 registers were kept at the head rabbi's office in Tunis. And so Alain Nedja and Gilles Boulu indexed those ketubot. So very useful if your ancestors come from Leghorn. For the Tonsa Jews, we have registers of rabbinical notaries and the Dayanim, the rabbinical courts, which are available at the Tunisian National Archives, but again, mostly written in Ma'alak, in Sephardic cursive script and Tunisian Judeo-Arabic. 300 plus registers covering the period 1865 to 1969 that have been studied by Ines Sharfeddin, who's now an archivist at the Tunisian National Archives. 210 registers contain the records of rabbinical notaries, not only in Tunis, but also in provincial cities. And in those, you find full ketubot, you find inheritance documents, you find testimonies, certificates, all sorts of very useful documents for genealogical research. Unfortunately, very, very hard to use. That's an open research project. We have 56 registers of the rabbinical courts in Tunis, 20 registers from basically the first half of the 20th century covering legal actions, and 36 registers for the same periods covering ketubot summaries. Those ketubot summaries are the records that you can obtain as a certificate when you ask the office of a head rabbi in Tunis. And finally, you have 39 registers consisting of letters and accounts of merchants, 19 registers for correspondence in various tongues, and 20 registers which are accounts of traders, shopkeepers, which have historical and possibly some genealogical interest, but that have not really been exploited so far. So as an example, you have one page of a register of the rabbinical courts, and this is a summary of ketubot. And so it's basically a form, and you see the dates of the ketubah, the bride's name, the father of the bride, the groom's name, and the father of the groom, the amount of the ketubah. And this document is the document where the certificate from the office of the head rabbi is produced. So this is a summary, and the full ketubah, the full text of the ketubah, should be located in the notary's registers where it's recorded, where the original record lies, including the signatures of the bride, of the bride's father, of the witnesses. Let's have a look at cemeteries. In Tunisia, first of all, in Tunis, we have the extant cemetery called Le Borgel. That has more than 30,000 graves, inaugurated formally in 1894, but we actually find some graves from 1890. We have a tombstone database with pictures of tombstones accessible to members of Cercle Genealogie Juive, with 5,300 tombstones indexed. So that's a small proportion of the total. Unfortunately, about half of the graves are not legible anymore. We expect to extend the number of tombstones with pictures. We do that in partnership with the Association for the Preservation of Jewish Cemeteries in Tunisia, who are taking pictures, and so we expect that number of tombstones to increase. There used to be a Jewish cemetery in Tunis, in the center of Tunis, and unfortunately that was destroyed in 1958 by the municipality of Tunis. There are no known records, but for rabbinical graves, we have an article, or actually a series of articles, by a Turkish rabbi called Arditi, who came to Tunisia, and he wrote several articles in La Revue Tunisienne on rabbinical tombstones. There is a database for those tombstones in Jeffrey Malka's excellent site, sephardicgen.com. And as an example, you can see the Arditi article about the tombstone of Rav Moïse d'Armont. And so he's basically copied the epitaph and translated the epitaph. So Rav Moïse d'Armont died in 1741, and this is the only record surviving. This is part of the only record surviving of this old Jewish cemetery in Tunis. I'll skip this in the interest of time. There are cemeteries in the Tunisian province, in Sousse, about 5,000 graves. We have just a few indexed. In Sfax, we have almost all graves indexed for Sfax. That's almost 1,200 tombstones. Kerouan, very small cemetery, it's still extant. We have a few graves. There are other Jewish cemeteries. We have some tombstones indexed for Zarzis and Gabes. And it's important to note there are no known burial registers for any of these cemeteries, unfortunately. So sources in France. Sources in France come basically from two places. One is sources in France that have been kept from the French period in Tunisia, the French protectorate in Tunisia. And then you have Jews who migrated to France after the end of the protectorate, after Tunisian independence. So first of all, a brief recap of how to look for people in France, for Tunisian Jews who immigrated to France after Tunisian independence. So very useful, and this is very new as well. You have all French death records from 1970 to the present that are now published by INSEE, which is the French Statistical Institute. And I've put the link to a database where you can query those death records. You will find all of this in the handout. Once you have found the death record you're looking for, based on a name and maybe a date, this database will give you the city in which the death occurred, and then you can ask for the actual death records. Depending on where it is, you have different websites, and this will be in the handout. For Paris, you also have digitized death records online from 1860 to 1919 for birth records, 1860 to 1944 for marriage records, and 1860 to 1986 for death records, with indexes as well. And so the link is indicated there. And then for BMD records in the rest of France outside of Paris, this is found in regional archives, and you have a link to a map where you can click, and this will take you to the website of the regional archives. Now, a very important thing that happened during the French protectorate is that Tunisian Jews became French. Some of them became French. Unlike Jews in Algeria, Jews in Tunisia did not get a blanket French nationality for everyone. They had to ask. Tunisian Jews had to ask to obtain French nationality. And the way they asked is by filling forms, of course. We're in France. And there was a lot of documents that they had to provide. There was an inquiry about them. All of that has been kept in naturalization files, and you can actually obtain copies of those files either by going to the French National Archives near Paris, or by asking French National Archives for an 18 euros processing fee. So what you find in there has tremendous genealogical value. You find parents of the person who has been naturalized, you find their children, you find their siblings, you have a lot of biographical details, levels of income, military service, their profession, their residences. You have some unique documents, including the actual request by the person asking for naturalization with their signature. You have the internal processing documents from the French administration, and from 1940, roughly, you have pictures of people. So almost 7,000 Tunisian Jews obtained naturalization. They asked for naturalization for themselves plus their family, so that's actually a lot more individuals, but there were 6,700 requests, mostly starting from 1922. And so that's a very, very useful source for Tunisian Jews who became French. I'll skip on the examples because I'm looking at the time here and I'm taking too much time, speaking too much. But this is an example of an Abraham Samama who writes to the French Minister of Justice asking for naturalization. There is a very useful site published by the French National Library called Gallica, and that has a lot of information of digitized documents from the end of the 19th century onwards, and a lot of that deals with Tunisian Jews. So you can just plug in a name in the search box, and this will find a lot of documents. If you want to be a little bit more focused, you can look at French-speaking newspapers in Tunisia, especially at Dépêche Tunisienne, for which you have a link. and this will give you a lot of stuff on Tunisian Jews. You have two very useful books. You have a biographical dictionary of people in Tunisia that was published in 1912. And as a little example, you have an Ernest Thérèse. He's actually a Tunisian Jew who was born in 1861 in Djerba, and his current profession and his work. And then you have court records from the appeals courts in Tunis and in Algiers, and for some, if not all of the judgments, only judgments that made jurisprudence, and in those judgments you have the full text, and so you have some really interesting details on some people, and all of that you find in Gallica. That's all online and digitized. A lot of stuff there, so I really encourage you to go and have a look. Let's look at BMD records. You have consular BMD records covering French citizens abroad, including in Tunisia, and those are held by diplomatic archives near Paris, only for French citizens. And then we have the civil BMD registers implemented by the French Protectorate from 1886, which we have copies, and all of that is available in the BECAN database for Salle de Genealogie Juive. I'm showing you an example here of an actual birth records. Sorry, no, is that a birth record or a death record? It's a death record. So this is a young girl, and she dies in Tunis in 1888, and you have the names of her parents, but you also have the name of her grandfather and the name of her uncle, with some dates for them, with some signatures. It's a really useful set of records because you find not only the person who is the subject of a record, but you'll also find the witnesses and how they're related to the person. Really useful. And we have 22,000 such records in the database, mostly death records. Birth records start to be recorded in 1909. We have a lot of death records that take us for people who are 60-year-old when they die, or 70-year-old, take you all the way back to the start of the 19th century. There are a lot of other things in French diplomatic archives, some of which are indexed in the Régie database of Salle de Genealogie Juive, especially consular correspondence, the correspondence between the consul, the French consul, and some private individuals, and some passports covering the 19th century. That's very useful. And I'm coming here to the second fundamental source for Tunisian Jews. Those are the French protected subjects of the French consulate in Tunis. So what happened in 1830, France conquered Algeria. And once that happened, Algerian subjects, including Algerian Jews, could travel to Tunis, for instance, which was the country next door, and claim French protection in Tunisia. And to do that, they had to register with the French consul, and fortunately, starting in 1830, French consulates kept this information. So we have a lot of Algerian Jews traveling to Tunisia and claiming French protection, which was very useful to avoid taxation and to avoid being subject to the courts, to Tunisian courts, which were not very favorable to Jews. So they, when they applied for protection, they came in front of the courts of the French consul, and that was a lot more favorable. So they did this, but not only Algerian Jews did this. Tunisian Jews also said, well, I have ancestors in Algeria, so I can claim protection of the French consul. And so you find a lot of Tunisian Jews and a lot of Algerian Jews. And this starts in 1830, very useful registers in there. You have an example here. You find the person's name, his father's name, his spouse, possibly multiple spouses in some cases, their children, some additional genealogical information. For instance, here we have possibly his uncle. Actually, it turns out it's not his uncle. And we also have a physical description. It's almost as good as a picture, and his profession. All of this, you have a lot of additional papers with additional information. All of this is indexed in a book that I wrote with Liliane Nedjar. And so we have between 2,500 and 3,000 registrations of protected subjects, plus information on their parents, spouses, children, relatives, and so that's a total of 10 to 12,000 protected subjects in total. It's a very useful source, especially for the Tuamsa, the indigenous Tunisian Jews. And that takes you all the way to the beginning of the 19th century. Let's move on to other foreign sources. The reason why you find Tunisian Jews mentioned in records, for instance, in the UK, is that Tunisian Jews who traded with other countries very often recorded their contracts with other merchants or with a ship captain who was carrying their merchandise. These contracts were registered at European consulates. A lot of those were registered at the French consulate, but we also have some registered in the British consulates, in the Netherlands consulates, and in other European consulates. So we have notarial acts for instance, at the UK consulate, starting from the 17th century. We have consular correspondence. We have consular court records of the UK consulate in Tunisia, and we have some British protected subjects as well. So this can be very useful. For instance, the consular records is, you have an example here of a testimony in 1909 that Mr. Shalom Levy, who's currently residing in Sousa, Tunisia, was born in that city in 1888, and he's the son of a British subject. So this is the sort of stuff that you find that can be very useful. There are no indexes, unfortunately. You have to go on site. If you know that a Tunisian Jew comes from Gibraltar or from Malta, typically you will find some mentions of them in UK consular records. Same thing in the Netherlands, consular records, especially notarial acts and consular correspondence. This is an example of a Tunisian Jew, Shalom Bessis, who trades with Livorno, with Leghorn, in 1786, and there's a paper certifying that he's received merchandise from Leghorn, and it's smaller than they expected. And so you find these beautiful signatures there as well. Unfortunately, again, no index. We are working on this, so we might publish some stuff later on, but there's no current index. I'll skip the records that you can find in Malta in the interest of time. But again, 1864, a lot of Tunisian Jews, 2,000 Tunisian Jews found refuge in Malta. That happened again in 1881 during the French conquest. And because Malta is just a day's navigation away from Tunisia, there has long been, in the 19th century, there has long been a very small community of Tunisian Jews in Malta. Let's talk quickly about really old sources. This was written in the hand of Maimonides. This is a draft of his legal code, the Mishneh Torah. And this is found in the Cairo Geniza. So what we're looking at here is, can we go back beyond the 17th century? We have examples. There's a very good book that I encourage you to read if you're interested in Tunisian Jews, called Les Enfants d'Ishmael, that's in French. And this was written by Denis Cohen-Tanouji, who traces his ancestry back to Sicily in the 14th century. to someone named Vita Tanugius in Palermo in the 14th century, probably exiled from Tangiers. And he traces his ancestors, so that helps a lot, in the 14th century from current-day Tunisia. Going even further than this, in the 11th to 13th century, you might have heard of the Cairo Geniza. It is about 250,000 leaves, folios, most in the periods covering 11th to 13th century. It turns out that the correspondence, commercial correspondence, involves many Tunisian and Sicilian Jews based in Kairouan and Madia in Tunisia. And the reason is that the Cairo Geniza was found in what is called the Palestinian synagogue in Old Cairo. And apparently this synagogue managed to attract Tunisian expatriates. And so a lot of the papers that you find in the Geniza actually deal with Tunisian Jews. And a lot of work has been done by historians. There's a fantastic site called the Friedberg Geniza Project. I have the link here, which has digitized all the documents with indexes. You can work on the documents. And you find in the Cairo Geniza a lot of familiar family names from Tunisian Jews today. So you can actually reconstruct entire genealogies. And the great specialist of this was Shlomo Dov Goitheim, who's published extensive histories of Jews in that period based on the Cairo Geniza. And here I've shown two trees that he published in an article which show Tunisian Jews in the 11th century. So it is possible, it's just very hard. What are we working on? Just a recap that you'll find in the handouts. This is a recap of the key sources with a number of records that you'll find, the period covered, and how to access those records. I hope you find this useful. What else are we working on? Tunisian National Archives, the rabbinical notaries. We'd very much like to transcribe those, index those, and focusing starting with the ketubot, because this is very basic material. We're working on an index of the ketubot in the first half of the 20th century. We are continuing to work on the archives of the French consulates in Tunisia, and we will publish the records of the Justice of the Peace of the French consulate in Tunisia. It's a court to which a lot of Tunisian Jews came to sue people or to be sued, and we have very good records of those. We're also working on the archives of the British consulate in Tunisia and the Dutch consulate in Tunisia. In the future, I hope to work on other foreign consulates in Tunisia and on the records of the Tunisian rabbinates. This is it for today. I think I've spoken a bit longer than I intended to, but hopefully this has given you a good overview. Again, to recap, two really key sources, BMD records starting from 1886. We have a good database for that, and protected subjects starting in 1830. There is a book for that, and you can also access those in French archives. I'll stop speaking for now, give the floor back to Gary, and let you ask any questions that you might have. Thanks for listening so far.
Wow, thank you so much for an amazing presentation. I thought we had a lot of work to do. I see you are also very, very busy, and you have a lot of very important resources that you can tap still. So you should live and be well, and we look forward to seeing more and more of the materials being made available. The handout will be available to you. We'll send it out in the email that we will send out tomorrow following this presentation. If there are questions at the moment, you can put them in the chat box, or I will pass them along. People are thanking you very much for the presentation. And I think they're overwhelmed. They can't think of what to ask. There was a lot of material there, and I know that people are going to try to follow the information you're giving in the handout. And if your email is there, I know people will be in touch with you. Thank you very much, everybody, for being with us this evening. We look forward to seeing you at the upcoming sessions that we're having in the coming weeks. There's something at least twice, if not 3 times, and even some weeks in June, there are 4 days of lectures that we have. We look forward to seeing you again at one of our lectures soon. Have a good evening to everyone, or a good day. I know we have people in America as well, and we thank you for being with us. Thierry, thank you
you
so
guys.
much.
Thank you everyone.